While I was burying my husband alone, my children were already changing the locks in our home and putting my belongings outside. But the next morning, when the lawyer read the will, their faces went pale. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. It was still raining when I left the cemetery. The ground was soft. The grass clung to my shoes, and the flowers on William's grave had already begun to sink into the mud. I lingered for a long moment, watching the last handful of mourners drift toward their cars. The silence in a cemetery has its own kind of cruelty. Too clean, too final. It's been 2 weeks, and my husband of 40 years was gone. And for the first time in my life, I didn't know where to go next. The drive home took 40 minutes. The windshield wipers kept time with the thoughts in my head, uneven, heavy, senseless. I told myself that my children would be there waiting. I imagined my son David standing by the porch, trying to look strong. My daughter Lisa fussing over coffee cups. Even Emma, my daughter-in-law, her perfect hair unmoved by the rain. It was a picture I needed to believe in. But when I turned into our driveway, that picture shattered. A white moving van was parked near the garage. Cardboard boxes sat on the porch. My porch stacked like a shipment of someone else's life. I recognized my suitcases, the old wicker basket from the kitchen, William's reading lamp. At first, my mind refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. I stepped out of the car, clutching my purse like an anchor. The air smelled of wet pine and betrayal. The front door didn't open. My key didn't fit. I tried again, the metal scraping uselessly. Then the door opened from the inside. David stood there, his expression a careful blend of guilt and righteousness. "Mom," he said quietly, "you shouldn't be here." I laughed, a small, nervous sound that cracked in the middle. "This is my house, David. What are you talking about?" He stepped aside, and behind him I saw Emma, always composed, always sweetly poisonous. She had her arms crossed, wearing one of William's old sweaters. "It's just for now," she said in her calm, reasonable tone. "We thought it might be better if you stayed somewhere else for a while, until things settle." Settle. My voice rose despite myself. William was buried 2 weeks ago. Lisa appeared on the stairs holding her phone, her face pale but firm. "Mom, please don't make this harder. You need time. We all do. We're just trying to keep things organized." I looked at my boxes again, at the labels written in Lisa's neat handwriting. Mom's clothes, kitchen stuff, miscellaneous. It was as if I had already been archived. Something inside me went still, the kind of stillness that feels like drowning. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just nodded, turned back toward my car, and walked through the rain. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before I got the door open. I sat there until night fell, listening to the soft drumming of rain on the roof, watching the light from my car windows go out one by one. At some point, I must have slept. The stiffness in my neck woke me, with the first gray light of morning. My clothes smelled of cold and grief. I wiped the fog from the windshield and saw movement inside the house. My children, my own flesh and blood, were having breakfast at my table. I could have driven away right then, but I didn't. Something habit, pride, maybe the stubborn ghost of William kept me there. At 9 sharp, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. It was Mr. Collins, our family lawyer. He stepped out with his briefcase and a solemn look that told me he had been up most of the night. I followed him toward the porch. David met us at the door again, this time looking uneasy. "You didn't tell us you were coming," he muttered. "I don't need an invitation," I replied. "Your father's attorney asked to see all of us." We gathered in the living room. The boxes were gone. The furniture had been rearranged. Even the smell felt different, sterile, as if they'd already tried to erase me. Mr. Collins placed his papers on the coffee table, adjusting his glasses. "Before we begin," he said, "I need to confirm that everyone present is listed in Dr. Reed's final testament." The word final made Lisa flinch. I sat down on the edge of the couch, my hands clasped tight in my lap. David leaned against the mantel. Emma perched beside him like a cat, ready to pounce. Mr. Collins opened the folder. The rustle of paper was deafening. As per Dr. William Reed's last will and testament, he began dated 6 months prior to his passing. He paused, glancing at me, then continued. The estate, including the family home, financial accounts, and all associated assets, are to be transferred solely to his legal spouse, Mrs. Dorothy Reed. Silence thick absolute. Lisa blinked as if she hadn't heard correctly. Emma's mouth opened, then closed again. David straightened, color draining from his face. "That's impossible," Emma said finally, her voice trembling with polite venom. "William promised." He told David. "I have copies of the signed documents." Mr. Collins interrupted gently, "All properly notarized." I watched them all, feeling an unfamiliar calm settle over me. My heartbeat slowed. The trembling in my hands stopped. For the first time since yesterday, I felt something close to balance. Emma turned on David, whispering furiously. Lisa's phone slipped from her hand and landed on the rug with a dull thud. I stood. "I think you should all leave my house," I said quietly. Now, David looked at me as though seeing me for the first time. "Mom, no," I said. "Not anymore." I walked to the window. The rain had stopped and sunlight broke through the clouds in thin, reluctant lines. The reflection in the glass showed my face, pale, tired, but composed. Behind me, chairs scraped, voices rose and fell. Doors opened and shut. And then silence again. I didn't turn around. The air in the room was different now, cleaner, sharper, almost weightless. That was the morning everything changed. I spent the first night after the reading of the will in a roadside motel off Highway 12, the kind of place where the curtains smell of cigarette smoke and the ice machine rattles all night. I lay awake staring at the water stain on the ceiling, thinking about how quiet the world becomes when everything you counted on collapses in a single day. It wasn't grief anymore. Grief had shape and rhythm. This was something colder, an emptiness too heavy to cry through. My phone buzzed twice that night. Once it was Lisa, then David. I didn't answer either call. Whatever they had to say, it could wait. By morning, I made a list on the back of a receipt. Things I'd lost. My husband, my home, the illusion that my children loved me unconditionally, the woman I used to be. Gentle, accommodating, polite, and kind. The simplicity of it made me almost laugh. I folded the paper and slipped it into my wallet like a talisman, a small reminder that I had nothing left to lose. The first rational thought came when I turned on the motel's weak coffee pot. They were too ready. The locks, the boxes, the smug certainty in Emma's voice. None of that happened overnight. They'd been preparing long before William died. That realization hurt worse than the funeral. I opened my laptop, logged into the joint account William and I had shared for years. Access denied. The password had been changed. My chest tightened, but the panic didn't last long. I wrote down another note. Check secondary accounts. Find Collins again. By 10 a.m., I was dressed, calm and almost frighteningly clear-headed. I hadn't felt that way in years. There's something liberating about being underestimated. My children thought they had buried me along with their father. They had no idea that the woman driving out of that parking lot was not the same one who'd stood at the grave yesterday. Mr. Collins greeted me with a kind of weary respect when I arrived at his office. "Mrs. Reed," he said, standing quickly. I didn't expect you so soon. I don't have the luxury of time. I replied. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. You understand that your children may contest the will. They already called this morning. Of course they did. I leaned forward. Tell me what they don't know. He hesitated, tapping his pen. Dr. Reed was meticulous. He kept multiple records, digital, physical. There are properties in his name your children might not be aware of. Investments, accounts, but to access them, we'll need verification of ownership, identification. I can get whatever you need, I said quickly. He gave me a long look. Mrs. Reed, forgive my bluntness, but are you sure you want to go through this? I smiled, not kindly. Mr. Collins, I just wanted to be honest. When I left his office, the autumn sun was blinding. I sat in my car for a long moment, feeling the heat of the steering wheel under my palms. That was the first time I felt something close to control. My husband had been a clever man, but he had also been a secretive one. If he trusted anyone, it was me, and somewhere in those hidden files and safety boxes lay the truth about everything he'd left behind. That night, I returned to the motel and started combing through my old emails, receipts, insurance documents. There were patterns, small transfers to accounts I'd never seen, recurring references to a firm in Chicago, a key deposit box listed under my name. I didn't understand the full picture yet, but I knew one thing. William hadn't left our fortune to be eaten by the people who replaced the locks. By the third day, I stopped shaking. I stopped waiting for an apology that would never come. On the 4th, I drove to our old lake house, an hour from town, mostly forgotten. The place was still in my name. William used it for writing. The air smelled of pine and dust. I opened all the windows and sat on the deck until sunset, watching the water darken. I found his study just as he had left it. On the desk, there was a photo of us from 20 years ago. Before the money, before the children turned ambition into a religion, behind the frame, tucked flat against the wood, was a small brass key with a note in William's handwriting. For when they forget who you are, my heart stuttered. I didn't know what it meant yet, but it felt like a message. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. When I woke, the world was quiet but not cruel. My plan was forming, solid, and deliberate. It began with that key. I made myself coffee, strong and bitter, then wrote another list, this time titled Next Steps. Identify where the key belongs. Confirm all assets listed under William's name. Protect my legal standing before they move again. The handwriting was steady, determined. I drove back to town that afternoon and stopped outside my old house. The curtains were drawn. My car reflected faintly in the window. For a moment, I thought I saw Emma inside, walking from room to room like she owned it. Maybe she thought I wasn't angry anymore. Not yet. What I felt was something colder, quieter, a resolve that sat deep in my bones. They believed I was broken. Let them. By nightfall, I had transferred what little money remained in my private account, made a call to a friend who worked in banking, and emailed Mr. Collins to schedule another meeting. The woman who had once cried over dinner plates and family photos was gone. The one who replaced her was watching, calculating, waiting for the right moment to strike. And in that silence, I understood something profound. Revenge doesn't always begin with rage. Sometimes it starts with lists written on motel receipts and the soft click of a key you haven't used yet. The brass key burned in my pocket as if it carried its own pulse. I kept running my thumb over the edges while I drove to the bank. It was the same branch William had used for years. White stone old-fashioned tellers, the kind of place that still smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and paper ink. When I told the clerk my name, she looked me over with polite detachment. "Do you have identification, Mrs. Reed?" she asked, already knowing who I was. Grief gives people a certain visibility. They recognize your loss before your face. I handed over my driver's license and the small brass key. Her expression changed when she saw it. "One moment, please." She disappeared behind a frosted glass door. I could hear the muffled click of her shoes on tile. Minutes later, she returned with a manager, a thin man with silver hair and careful hands. "Mrs. Reed," he said quietly, "would you follow me?" He led me through a hallway lined with portraits of former directors and into a small room. On the table sat a safety deposit box. He inserted his master key alongside mine and turned both locks. Inside there were 3 envelopes, a USB drive, and a photograph of William and me at the lake house. My breath caught. The manager stepped back discreetly. "Take your time," he murmured and left. The first envelope held a handwritten note. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't get to explain everything. I made mistakes, Dorothy. Trust Collins. The truth will protect you." The second envelope contained a copy of an insurance policy naming me as the sole beneficiary. Not the children, not the trust, just me. The third was a bank statement from a private account in Chicago, the same one I'd seen referenced in my husband's emails. I sat there, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. William had known what was coming. He'd known his children were circling. For the first time, I felt something that wasn't grief. It was validation. I gathered everything carefully, placed it back into the box, and locked it. Before I left, I asked the manager if my children had access to any of William's accounts. He checked, frowning slightly. "No, Mrs. Reed, only you." "Good," I said too quickly. Outside, the wind had picked up. The day was bright, but sharp, the kind of light that exposes every flaw. I stood by my car, staring at the bank entrance, feeling the first faint hum of possibility. That afternoon, I met with Collins again. He studied the documents I'd found, his brow tightening. "This changes things," he said. "Finally, there's enough here to establish your control over the estate. But you should know, David and Emma are already consulting another attorney. They're preparing a claim of mental incompetence." I let out a humorless laugh. "They think I'm unfit. They'll argue that grief and age have impaired your judgment," he said carefully. "How convenient," I murmured. "They bury me emotionally, and now they want to do it legally." Collins hesitated, then leaned forward. "If you want to fight this, you'll need evidence, records of transactions, proof of your husband's intentions, and witnesses who can attest to your capability." "I can get that," I said. He nodded slowly. "Be cautious. They'll watch every move you make." When I left his office, dusk had begun to fall. The city lights flickered on one by one like cautious witnesses. I felt the edge of fear creeping in again. But this time, it didn't paralyze me. It sharpened me. That evening, I stopped at a diner for dinner. I hadn't eaten properly in days. As I sipped black coffee, I noticed a familiar car outside, a silver SUV, Emma's. She was sitting inside, pretending to scroll through her phone, but her eyes kept darting toward the window. I didn't look away. Our gazes met briefly through the glass. She smiled, slow and deliberate, and then drove off. By the time I got back to the lake house, my resolve had hardened into something like armor. They knew I was moving. That meant they were nervous. I turned on the small desk lamp in William's study and spread the documents across the wood. My husband had left me breadcrumbs, and I would follow everyone. That night, I found an old external hard drive hidden behind a row of books. It contained years of correspondence, emails, letters, scanned receipts. One file caught my eye, trust revisions, draft 2 PDF. Inside, William had written detailed notes about his growing distrust of David and Emma, words underlined in red. "If they press, They'll ruin her, protect her. My hands went cold. He'd seen this coming. He had tried to warn me, but I hadn't listened. I printed copies of everything and locked them in my own safe. For the first time since his death, I felt close to William. Not as a husband, but as an ally. The following morning, I called Collins. "I have what we need," I said simply. He sighed with audible relief. "Then we can begin formal proceedings." The word formal carried weight. It meant the start of something irreversible. I hung up, took a long shower, and dressed deliberately. Navy blazer, jeans, hair tied back. When I looked in the mirror, I almost didn't recognize myself. The softness was gone. I drove to town again, this time to the courthouse to file for full execution of William's will. The clerk stamped the documents with a dull thud. The sound echoed like a starting pistol. By afternoon, my phone began to buzz. First, call from Lisa. Then, a call from David. I ignored them both. That night, as the sun bled into the horizon, I poured myself a glass of William's Old Scotch and sat by the window of the lake house. The surface of the water shimmered like metal. Everything still hurt, but the pain no longer owned me. It was fuel. They wanted to make me question my sanity. Instead, they'd reminded me of who I used to be. A woman capable of building a life from nothing. The first step was complete. And though it felt small, almost invisible to anyone else, I knew what it meant. It meant war. The courthouse filings set everything in motion. Within a week, papers were delivered to my children's lawyer, and the silence that followed was the kind that hums before a storm. I had expected anger, of course, but not the speed. On the third morning, there was a knock on the lake house door. When I opened it, David stood there, hands in his pockets, trying to look like the reasonable son. Behind him, Emma's eyes flickered with something sharper than grief. "Mom," he began softly, "we just want to talk." I stepped aside, motioning toward the living room. The air between us was taut, like a stretched wire ready to snap. Emma started first. "We know you've been busy," she said, taking a seat without waiting for permission. "Lawyers, banks, it's just unnecessary, don't you think? Unnecessary." I repeated, sitting across from her. "You changed the locks on my house 2 weeks after your father's funeral." She smiled faintly. "We thought you needed rest. You weren't yourself." David cut in, his voice tightening. "This isn't what Dad would have wanted, Mom. Dragging everything into court. Your father wrote the will," I interrupted. "He made his choice." Emma leaned forward, the veneer of civility cracking just a little. "You can't manage all this alone. The lawyers will eat you alive. If you just transfer the main account to David temporarily, it would make everything easier." There it was, the demand dressed as concern. I stood slowly. "Get out of my house." David's expression hardened. "Mom, we're trying to protect you." "No," I said, voice steady now. "You're trying to finish what you started." For a moment, no one moved. Then Emma rose, adjusted her coat, and smiled that smooth, contemptuous smile. "Fine," she said. "We'll do it your way." When the door closed behind them, my knees almost gave out. My body trembled, not from fear, but from the pressure of restraint. I had faced them without breaking. That alone felt like victory. I called Collins the next morning. He sounded grim but calm. "They've filed an injunction claiming coercion in the creation of the will. They're saying you influenced your husband while he was sick." I laughed sharp and humorless. "They're accusing me of manipulating a man I nursed through cancer for a year. They'll twist anything," he said quietly. "We'll respond with medical records and testimony from his doctor. But it's going to get rough." I stared out at the lake. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting the clouds like a mirror. "Let them come," I said. Over the next week, I worked. Every morning began with documents. Every night ended with notes. I gathered everything. William's correspondence, copies of his prescriptions, even video messages he'd recorded for the hospital staff. In one clip, he thanked me for holding everything together and mentioned updating his will to make sure Dorothy's protected. That sentence alone could dismantle their entire claim. Meanwhile, my children's tone changed. The phone calls became colder, more formal. Lisa, always the soft one, left a voicemail in tears. Mom, I didn't want any of this. Emma's pushing David. Please just talk to us. I didn't call back. Sympathy had been the knife they'd used on me before. I wasn't handing it to them again. Then came the real threat. Late one night, as I was locking the front door, a car slowed outside the house. Headlights lingered too long. When I checked the mailbox the next morning, there was an unmarked envelope inside. Inside, a single sheet of paper. Drop the case, or you'll lose everything else you have left. No signature, just ink, the kind pressed down hard enough to nearly tear through. I called Collins immediately. They've crossed the line, I said. He exhaled. Keep the note. Don't respond. It's intimidation. They're desperate, but I knew desperation could be dangerous. That night, I slept with a kitchen knife under my pillow and the phone on the nightstand. Every creak of the floorboards made my pulse jump. 2 days later, I turned the fear into focus. I visited the hospital where William had been treated and requested his full medical records. The attending physician, Dr. Morrison, remembered me. You were the only one here, Mrs. Reed, he said kindly. Your children visited once or twice, but you never left his side. Would you be willing to testify to that? I asked. He hesitated, then nodded. If it comes to that, yes. When I left, I sat in the parking lot and cried, not from sadness, but from the sudden, fierce clarity that I was winning. That evening, Collins called again. Their lawyer asked for mediation. He said, they want to avoid public exposure. Of course, they do, I murmured. They're not afraid of losing money. They're afraid of losing reputation. Should I entertain it? He asked. No, I said firmly. We finished this in court. After that, the house felt different. The silence was no longer heavy. It was waiting. I took a few days to rest, if rest was the right word. Walks by the water, tea at sunrise, the hum of cicadas at dusk. It was the first time in months I allowed myself to breathe without dread. I began to dream again. Fragmented, strange dreams of the past. William laughing by the fireplace. The children chasing each other through the garden. Then the same dream every night. Me standing on the porch as they changed the locks. But this time I wasn't crying. I was watching. The morning I woke without shaking. I knew the worst had passed. I looked around the quiet lake house, the open windows, the sun filtering through dust mows, and felt a calm that almost frightened me. I wasn't the woman they'd pied. I was the woman they'd underestimated. They thought I'd crawl back, apologize, surrender. Instead, I was preparing to walk into court with a doctor's statement, financial records, and a recorded threat. When I called Collins to tell him, he said, Dorothy, you're about to hit them harder than they expect. I smiled faintly. Good. That night, I stood on the porch, watching the ripples of the lake catch the last light. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, a storm gathering on the horizon. I felt no fear, only readiness. The mediation request was the first sign they were scared. The second was the knock on my door. 3 days later, I didn't need to look through the peephole to know who it was. Only my daughter knocked that softly. When I opened the door, Lisa stood there, her eyes red, her voice trembling. Mom, can I come in? She was alone. No Emma, no David. That detail mattered. I stepped aside, wordlessly, watching her look around the lake house like she was visiting a stranger's home. It's nice here, she said quietly. Peaceful. Peaceful as new, I replied. She gave a shaky laugh. I guess it would be. We sat in silence for a moment, the air between us filled with everything we weren't saying. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a small stack of papers. David doesn't know I came, she said quickly, and Emma would kill me if she did. But, Mom, this has gone too far. You could stop all of this before it destroys us. Destroys you. I corrected softly. She bit her lip. Emma's making David do things. Ugly things. Lawyers, threats. That note you got, she doesn't think we know, but I do. She's scared. So, am I. Her voice broke. And for a brief, dangerous second, I saw the little girl she used to be. The one who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. My instinct was to comfort her, but I didn't. I couldn't afford softness anymore. What do you want, Lisa? I asked. She slid the papers across the table. A settlement. You keep the house and part of the insurance. David handles the business accounts. We can end this quietly. I studied her face. She was shaking not just from nerves, but from something deeper. Guilt, maybe, or the realization that she was in over her head. Who wrote this? I asked. Emma, she admitted. But it's fair, Mom. You don't need to go through a trial. You're tired. I can see it. I let out a slow breath. Lisa, did you ever stop to think about how this looks to me? You stand on my porch after your husband's funeral, after you threw me out of my own house and offer me a fraction of what your father left me. Because it's easier for you, she winced. I didn't throw you out. That was David and Emma. I finished for her. But you watched. Her tears fell silently this time. I just want us to be a family again. Families don't write each other threats. I said. She said nothing. After a long pause, I pushed the papers back across the table. Tell your brother and his wife I appreciate the offer. And tell them this. I'm not tired. Not anymore. Lisa stood, her shoulders trembling. You'll regret this. No, I said evenly. I regret trusting the wrong people for too long. When she left, I waited until her car disappeared down the road before I let myself exhale. My hands were steady, my heartbeat calm. Their attempt at reconciliation wasn't kindness. It was reconnaissance. They wanted to see if I'd cracked. I hadn't. That evening, I started gathering proof. Every email, message, and document they'd sent. Collins had already advised me to create backups. But I went further. I printed copies, stored them in waterproof envelopes, and hid one set in the attic. The next day, I received an email from an unknown address. No message, just an attachment. It was a photo of me outside the courthouse, time-stamped from the day I filed the will. Someone was following me. I stared at the screen for a long time, then clicked forward and sent it to Collins. His reply came 5 minutes later. Ignore it. It's intimidation again. But it helps us. Shows a pattern. That night, I slept soundly despite the threat. Something inside me had shifted. Fear had turned into something cold and clean. The following morning, Emma called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Dorothy, she began, voice syrup smooth. I hear Lisa came to see you. I just wanted to apologize for everything. We all said and did things we didn't mean. Your family, and this has gone too far. Let's meet. Just talk. No lawyers. Her tone was almost gentle, but I could hear the calculation underneath it. Where? I asked. Your old house dinner tomorrow night. David will cook your favorite pot roast. I almost laughed at the audacity. I'll think about it, I said, and hung up. The next day, I went, but not alone. I parked down the street, hidden behind a neighbor's truck, and watched through binoculars. I saw them through the kitchen window. Emma setting the table, David pacing. They were waiting for me, but something about their posture was off. Too alert, too rehearsed. I didn't knock. I didn't even step out of the car. Instead, I took photos, time-stamped clear shots, and drove straight to Collins. You were right, I told him. They're planning something. He looked at the images and nodded grimly. You made the right call. Stay away from them. We'll file harassment charges if they approach you again. As I left his office, the sky broke open with rain, sudden and relentless. I stood on the sidewalk, soaked but unmoving, feeling the weight of everything wash away. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with my collected evidence spread before me. Documents, photographs, recordings, each one a piece of armor. For the first time in months, I wasn't reacting. I was preparing. When I finally went to bed, I didn't dream of the past. I dreamed of the courtroom, the long table, the echo of footsteps, my children's faces. When the truth would finally come out, it didn't scare me anymore. Let them tempt me, manipulate me, cry, or threaten. I was done being a mother who forgave. Now, I was the woman who remembered. The next few weeks passed in a strange kind of silence, the kind that feels both safe and temporary. The rain stopped. The lake grew still again, and I began to rebuild a life that didn't revolve around waiting for the next attack. But war doesn't end just because you stop hearing gunfire. It only hides behind the trees. The calm of the morning cracked. At 8 a.m., I heard a car door slam outside. When I looked out the window, David and Emma were standing in the driveway holding coffee cups like casual visitors. Not today, I muttered to myself. I opened the door, just enough to make my point. You're trespassing. Emma smiled brightly. We just wanted to talk, Dorothy. No lawyers, no threats, just family. I don't have a family, I said flatly. She flinched, but recovered quickly. Come on, don't be dramatic. We all made mistakes. Let's put this behind us. David nodded, his voice quieter. Mom, please, we can fix this. You don't need to keep fighting. For a heartbeat, the word mom almost undid me. Almost. But then I saw Emma's hand tighten around her cup. The way her eyes flicked toward the front door, like she wanted me to invite them in. Manipulation wrapped in nostalgia. No, I said softly. You can't fix what you destroyed. Emma's smile vanished. You think you're strong because of a few papers and a will. You have no idea what we're capable of. David hissed. Emma, but she didn't stop. You're alone here, Dorothy. Alone. You think your dead husband can save you. He's gone. And when this is over, so will everything else. I closed the door, slowly, deliberately. Her voice carried through the wood, muffled but sharp. You'll regret this. The engine roared, tires sprayed gravel, and they were gone. I stood there for a long moment, hands still on the doorknob, breathing deeply until my pulse steadied. They had shown their true faces again. The masks were slipping. That evening, I returned to the group meeting. I didn't plan to speak, but when my turn came, the words poured out. Everything, the threats, the locks, the manipulation. But that night, fear visited me again. Not the suffocating kind, but a quiet tremor beneath my ribs. A warning, maybe. I checked the locks twice, then 3 times. As I sat by the window, I saw my reflection in the glass, older, sterner, unrecognizable. I didn't hate the woman staring back. She looked like someone who'd finally learned the cost of silence. In the distance, a flash of lightning illuminated the trees. For a second, I thought I saw a figure by the edge of the property. But when the light faded, there was only darkness and the whisper of the wind. I didn't move. I let the fear stay, small but alive. It reminded me that I wasn't done yet, because fear in the right hands becomes fuel. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat at the table and began drafting a new plan. One final precise strategy that would expose everything. The lies, the signatures, the intimidation. This time, I wouldn't just defend myself. I would make sure everyone saw who they truly were. By midnight, the outline was done. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. The courtroom smelled faintly of dust and coffee. It was small, too small for something this important, but maybe that was fitting. Families fall apart in quiet places. Collins sat beside me, flipping through papers with the precision of a surgeon. Across the aisle, David and Emma whispered furiously to their attorney. Lisa sat a few feet away, eyes downcast, fingers trembling in her lap. She wouldn't look at me. When the judge entered, everyone rose. My knees felt steady. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, sometimes with fear, sometimes with rage. But standing there, all I felt was clarity. The opposing counsel started with theatrics. Your Honor, he began smoothly. This case is a tragedy of misunderstanding. My clients, Mr. and Mrs. David Reed, acted only out of concern for their mother's well-being. They never sought to deprive her of her rights, only to ensure that Dr. William Reed's estate was managed responsibly. His words were polished, but they slid over me like oil on glass. I had come armed with truth, and truth doesn't need eloquence. When it was Collins's turn, his tone was calm, methodical. Mrs. Reed's husband, Dr. William Reed, executed a legally binding will 6 months prior to his death. The will explicitly names her as the sole beneficiary of his assets. The defendants, her own children, acted in bad faith, changing locks, threatening, and attempting to manipulate the plaintiff into relinquishing control of her property. We have evidence of each act. He handed a folder to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. The sound of pages turning filled the room. Then Collins turned to me. Mrs. Reed, would you please take the stand? The walk felt longer than it was. I sat, swore the oath, and looked straight ahead. He began gently. Mrs. Reed, could you describe what happened after your husband's funeral? I told him everything quietly, precisely, without embellishment. The rain, the boxes, the locks, the words my children had used to exile me from my own home. I spoke like someone reading a list of facts, but every word carried weight. When Collins asked about the letter William had left, I unfolded it and read aloud. Trust Collins. The truth will protect you. There was movement across the aisle, Emma shifting uncomfortably, David avoiding my gaze. Then came their lawyer's turn to cross-examine. Mrs. Reed, he said, forcing a sympathetic smile. Isn't it possible your husband was under medication that impaired his judgment when he wrote that will? No, I replied. He was lucid. His doctor confirmed it. He nodded, feigning patience. But grief can cloud one's memory, can it? Perhaps you misinterpreted your children's concern. They changed my locks while I was still mourning my husband. I cut in sharply. If that's concern, I'd hate to see neglect. A ripple of quiet laughter spread through the spectators. The lawyer flushed. He tried again. You seem angry, Mrs. Reed. I am, I said, but anger doesn't make me wrong. Collins leaned forward, sliding another piece of evidence across the table. Your Honor, Exhibit C, an unmarked letter delivered to Mrs. Reed threatening her to drop the case. The handwriting has been confirmed by an expert to match Mrs. Emma Reed's. Emma's head snapped up. That's a lie, she shouted. The judge's gavel struck once. Mrs. Reed, control yourself. David turned to her, whispering urgently, but she shoved his hand away. The mask was breaking. Collins didn't stop. We also have medical testimony from Dr. Morrison confirming that Dr. William Reed was fully competent when he signed his will, and a recorded voicemail from Mr. David Reed made 1 week after the funeral stating, quote, If Mom doesn't cooperate, we'll make her. The color drained from David's face. The courtroom buzzed. Play it, the judge ordered. The recording was brief, but the voice unmistakable, cold, calculating. My son's voice. When it ended, silence filled the room, dense, suffocating. Lisa began to cry, quietly. Emma sat rigid, eyes darting like a trapped animal. The judge looked at them for a long moment before speaking. I think I've heard enough. Collins leaned back, his expression unreadable. I kept my eyes on my children. For years, I had carried their excuses like stones in my pockets. Now, I felt them drop one by one. The ruling was swift. The court upheld Williams' will, affirmed my ownership of all assets, and issued a restraining order against harassment. But the victory didn't feel triumphant. It felt surgical, a necessary amputation. As the gavel fell, Emma stood abruptly, face twisted with fury. You think this is over, she hissed across the aisle. You'll die alone, Dorothy. You deserve it. I didn't flinch. Maybe, I said softly, but I'll die free. Security moved toward her, and she backed away, muttering curses. David sat motionless, staring at the table, as if the wood grain might save him. Lisa rose slowly, her face wet with tears. Mom, I'm sorry, she whispered. I looked at her, really looked, and for a moment saw the child she once was. But forgiveness is a luxury of those who haven't been buried alive. I turned away. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight was blinding. Cameras flashed. Reporters murmured questions, but their voices were distant, muffled by the roar in my ears. Collins said something about next steps, but I barely heard him. I walked down the courthouse steps slowly, deliberately, each step echoing like punctuation. Behind me, I heard Emma shouting something, David calling her name, Lisa sobbing. It didn't matter. The truth was out. The masks were gone. And for the first time since William's death, I felt the air in my lungs without weight. The verdict spread through town faster than I expected. By the next morning, it was in the local paper. Widow wins estate case against her own children. A clean headline for something so rotten. Collins called early to congratulate me, but his voice held the kind of caution reserved for people who've seen too many battles. You've won, he said. Now, be careful not to let them take the victory from you in another way. I knew what he meant. Winning wasn't the same as healing. I drove to my old house that afternoon, not to move back, but to see it one last time. The locks were still the ones they'd changed. The paint chipped near the frame. A for sale sign leaned in the yard, weather-beaten and crooked. It didn't look like home anymore. It looked like evidence. Inside, the air smelled stale, as though grief itself had soaked into the walls. I walked from room to room in silence, touching the furniture that had once been mine. Emma's perfume still clung faintly to the hallway. In the study, I found one of William's old cufflinks under the desk. I picked it up, small and cold, and slipped it into my pocket, not as a keepsake, more like a relic from a life that had finally finished. When I stepped outside again, the wind had picked up. My children were nowhere to be seen. Maybe that was mercy. By the end of the week, their world began to unravel. David lost his position at the firm after someone leaked the court documents showing he'd falsified financial statements. Emma's employer followed suit. Apparently, threatening your mother-in-law in writing wasn't the kind of publicity a corporate PR manager could recover from. Lisa withdrew from both of them moving out of their shared apartment. She sent me one message. I'm sorry. I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't reply. Collins finalized the property transfer and wired the remaining funds into my account. When I saw the balance, I didn't feel satisfaction, only exhaustion. Money couldn't buy back 40 years of motherhood. It couldn't erase the image of my son's face when the recording played. That night, I packed a single suitcase and drove to the coast. The road stretched ahead like a clean scar through the hills, empty and silver under the moon. For the first time in months, I didn't look in the rear view mirror. The cottage I rented was small, perched above the ocean, like it might slide into the water if the wind pushed hard enough. I liked that. It felt temporary, like a pause rather than an ending. I spent the first few mornings walking along the beach, letting the cold salt air strip away what was left of the courtroom. Grief lingered, of course, but quieter now, less like a wound and more like an old scar. One afternoon, while sorting through paperwork, I found William's letter again. Trust Collins. The truth will protect you. I folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer. The truth had done its job. A week later, Collins called to tell me the house had sold. The buyers wanted it, as is. It's done, he said simply. Good, I replied. Let it go. He hesitated. They've left town. You know, David and Emma. Things didn't go well for them. He's under investigation, and she filed for divorce. I didn't respond immediately. Then justice has its own rhythm, doesn't it? He chuckled softly. It does. After the call, I walked outside. The tide was low, the sand damp beneath my feet. I watched the water crawl toward the shore and thought about how slowly some things return. Dignity, trust, silence. That night, I opened a bottle of wine and sat on the porch, the sea wind tangling my hair. I wasn't celebrating. There was nothing to celebrate. The victory wasn't sweet. It was clean, surgical, final. Some nights I still saw their faces in my dreams. David's defiance collapsing into shame. Emma's fury curling into fear. Lisa's tears falling too late. I would wake before dawn, heart steady, eyes dry. Justice isn't peace. It's just the absence of noise. I began donating small amounts from the inheritance to shelters, to women's legal aid programs, to the same community center that I didn't tell anyone who I was. The anonymity felt right. One evening, months later, I received a letter forwarded by Collins. It was from Lisa, short, written in neat cursive. I'm working at a bookstore in Miami. I hope you're well. I think about you every day. I folded it once, then twice, and set it aside. Maybe one day I'd write back. Maybe not. The ocean became my metronome, the rhythm that kept me steady. The gulls cried at dawn. The waves broke against the rocks, and the days passed without intrusion. When I looked at myself in the mirror now, I saw a face carved by time, but not owned by it. The lines around my mouth were deeper, but my eyes were clear. One evening, as the sun sank into the water, I took William's cufflink from my pocket and dropped it into the tide. The current caught it, carried it away, and it vanished without a trace. That was the moment I finally understood what victory felt like. Not joy, not triumph, but release. I turned back toward the cottage, the sky bleeding gold behind me. The air smelled of salt and freedom. Inside, the phone rang once. I didn't answer. Whatever it was, apology, news, or another ghost, it could wait. I poured another glass of wine, sat by the window, and watched the last light fade. I had lost almost everything, but what I'd gained myself was enough. It's been a year since the trial. Time doesn't heal. Not really. It just rearranges the pain until it fits somewhere quieter. The ocean outside my window has become the measure of my days. Some mornings it's calm, others restless. I suppose I'm the same. The cottage is still mine. I've filled it with books, plants, and the kind of silence that doesn't hurt. Every Friday, I drive into town for groceries and coffee with Claire, a friend I met at the grocery store. We rarely talk about the past anymore. Sometimes she catches my hand mid-conversation, gives it a small squeeze, and that's enough. She knows what it means to survive something that was supposed to break you. People in town know me as the widow who lives by the cliffs. I don't correct them. They don't know about the courtrooms or the locks or the way my children's voices once made me tremble. They just see a woman who walks with her shoulders back and her eyes clear. That's all I ever wanted to exist without explanation. But the past has a way of sending echoes. One gray morning in late November, a letter arrived. No return address, only my name written in David's handwriting. My hand hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single page. Mom, I'm sorry. I lost everything. Emma left. I don't know where to go. I just wanted you to know you were right. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and set it beside the cup of coffee I'd been drinking. The liquid had gone cold. For a moment, I almost felt something. Pity, maybe, but it passed like a small wave over rock. I didn't respond. Later that week, Claire found me sitting by the water and said softly, "You could forgive him, you know." I shook my head. Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. And I don't want to forget. She nodded. Then don't. Just keep living. And that's what I did. By spring, the cottage garden had begun to bloom. Wild flowers, lavender, roses so red they looked almost angry against the pale sky. I planted them myself. It felt strange at first, digging into the earth after a year of paper and ink, of signatures and verdicts. But the soil was real in a way the courtroom never was. Some evenings I walked the beach collecting driftwood and sea lass. I've turned them into small sculptures that line the windowsills, tiny trophies of endurance. Every so often, I still get updates from Collins. He called last month, voice low but firm. They're in trouble again, he said. David's facing charges for fraud. Emma's name keeps showing up in the filings. Lisa's disappeared. No one knows where she's living. Do I need to do anything? I asked. No, he said. You've already done enough. After the call, I stood on the porch for a long time, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. The tide was violent that night, the wind sharp enough to sting, but I felt calm. Justice wasn't a single moment. It was a series of consequences echoing through time. I went inside and lit the fireplace. The warmth filled the room slowly, reaching the corners that still smelled faintly of salt. On the mantel sat a framed photo of William, the only one I kept. He was smiling in it, not the practiced smile he used at parties, but the one I remembered from quiet mornings before everything got complicated. I did it, I said aloud, though the words sounded strange in the stillness. You told me to trust the truth. I did. The fire cracked softly in reply. That night, I dreamed I was back in our old house, walking through rooms stripped of furniture. But instead of pain, there was peace. The walls were just walls. The ghosts had gone. When I woke, sunlight was spilling through the curtains. The sea was calm again. I brewed coffee, opened the windows, and breathed in the morning air. Sometimes I wonder what people would say if they knew the whole story, that a woman could lose her family and still find herself. That revenge, if done right, isn't cruelty. It's clarity. It's standing on solid ground after years of sinking sand. I don't think I'll ever see my children again. And maybe that's mercy for both of us. Some ties, once burned, shouldn't be rewoven. They only smell of smoke. The locals have stopped calling me the widow. Now, they just call me Dorothy. I volunteer at the community center twice a week, helping other women navigate their own storms, legal, emotional, sometimes both. I see their trembling hands, their quiet shame, and I encourage them by sharing my own story. In the evenings after everyone leaves, I lock up, walk home along the cliffs, and watch the last light sink into the ocean. The wind carries the faint sound of gulls and waves, familiar, eternal, cleansing. Every time I reach my front porch, I pause to look back at the horizon. It never looks the same twice. I used to think victory meant having everything returned. Now, I know it means never wanting it back. The world has turned. The chapter has closed. And the woman I once was, the obedient wife, the trusting mother, has been buried quietly beside the man who in the end gave me the strength to save myself. The tide keeps coming and going as tides do, and I keep standing here unbroken. Dear friends, thank you for spending this time with us and for walking through this story together. This is a completely fictional story created for entertainment and to reflect on traditional family values. It gently reminds us that family is always one of the most precious and important things in our lives. Along with love, let us also guide our children and our families to grow with gratitude, respect, and understanding. Thank you for being here, and we wish you peace and warmth until we meet again in the next video. Please like this video and subscribe for more. Also, let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled.